everyone. Welcome to Fluxim's 20th webinar. We will wait another 1 or 2 minutes until people drop in. I think people are still joining at the moment.
Great. Hello, everyone, so far.
Quite some people are still dropping in. That's very nice. All right, I would say let's get started. So my name is Matthias Diethelm. I will be your host today and also presenting later on a talk on ion parameter extraction. But first, it's my personal pleasure also to welcome our invited speaker, Professor Martin Stolterfoht from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Martin is an associate professor in the Department of Electronic Engineering, where he leads the photon energy conversion lab. His group works on understanding and improving the stability of perovskite-based solar cells, and that's what I like, with a particular focus also on the physical mechanisms that limit the device performance and lifetime. And I would say one group of, I don't know too many groups, which is truly always incorporating ion measurements like hysteresis measurement and also base, as you will hear later on, for measuring ion density, more or less on a regular basis. That's pretty nice for a heavily fabrication-based lab as well. So today Martin will speak about the role of mobile ions and shallow traps in governing degradation losses in perovskite solar cells. So this is highly relevant for all of you out there working on perovskite stability, ion migration, recombination losses, and so on. Before we start, just a quick note. During the talk of Martin, please write your questions in the Q&A chat, and we will go through them at the very end after my presentation as well. Martin, it's my big pleasure to introduce you. The floor is yours. You can share your slides.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matthias, and thank you to all for joining my talk. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Darren, as well, for inviting me. All right, let me share my presentation.
Yeah.
Okay, I hope you can see that now in presenter mode.
Yeah, it's on. Yeah.
And my laser pointer as well. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, you already introduced my title. I will be talking about mobile ions and shallow traps and how they influence the degradation in perovskites. Yes, so this is our campus at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. It's certainly a very nice campus. If you want to visit me, please feel free to write me an email anytime. All right, so let's get to it. Okay, so yeah, understanding degradation losses in perovskite solar cells. That is usually done by doing maximum power point tracking, as you know, measuring the efficiency as a function of time. And as you know, there can be a myriad of different losses and processes happen during the degradation, such as mechanical issues. The electrodes can burst, even due to the formation of iodine gas. Delamination can happen. Of course, there are so many chemical processes that can happen, which can sometimes trigger a chain reaction. But we try to focus foremost on understanding the recombination losses. And all of these chemical reactions that start to happen during the degradation, they will foremost create defects in mobile ions. And we are trying to especially understand what is actually the main culprit for degradation losses. And in particular, during the critical T80 lifetime that defines the overall lifetime of the solar cell. And in this regime, we still have a very controlled degradation loss. So nothing too crazy is happening yet. The electrode doesn't explode yet, or we don't have a shunt yet. So I think in this regime, we can understand the recombination losses. And mobile ions, as you know, probably some of you know, we have investigated over several years now by doing, for example, scan rate dependent JV measurements, which we call fast hysteresis measurements, where we determine the ion freeze efficiency, peak hysteresis, steady state, and the ionic loss from the difference of the ion freeze efficiency and steady state. And these ionic losses are often very important for the operational stability. These ionic losses can make up 3/4 of the total losses. It depends from cell to cell, of course, but they are always very significant. Yes, so this we have shown in this paper earlier in 2024. To make a short advertisement for recent work on this topic, being able to quantify mobile ions in this way opens up a lot of possibilities to investigate various phenomena and how they influence the ionic losses or ion migration, such as halide segregation, where we found that actually the onset time for halide segregation and the onset time for the ionic loss and the ion density evolution, it happens on the same, very similar timescales. So we believe that the ionic losses is perhaps the reason why halide segregated devices are rather unstable. And we also investigated in this work from my student Nikhil the recovery, where we observed a significant recovery after short light exposure, but when we stress the device too long, like for long-term MPP tracking, then the ionic losses stay actually locked in and do not recover, which is something we also want to investigate more in the future. In another work, we have also tried to mitigate these ionic losses, and in particular for wide bandgap perovskite 1.68 eV, we used a large cation dimethylammonium to large and widen the band gap and avoid mixed halide perovskite. So this is a very stable, pure iodine wide bandgap device, and it enabled very outstanding stabilities under harsh stressors like 1085 degrees, where we achieved the extrapolated T80 lifetime of over 8,000 hours, which is a record at the moment for such wide bandgap perovskites. In another work, we also tackled the problem of the limited reverse bias stability of perovskites, in particular with self-assembled monolayers, which break down quite at very low reverse biases at -1 volt. And my student Chifan has introduced a new amorphous self-assembled multi-layer, as he calls it, which pushed the reverse bias breakdown voltage to -17 volts. Okay, so that was a short advertisement. Let's come back to the main topic of this talk. So yeah, mobile ions and traps. So traps we have considered early on. For example, we see them in transient PL, where samples with transport layers have a much faster decay, and also the lifetime in the perovskite is limited, and we see very characteristic lifetimes. This can be explained by deep traps and by the interface recombination velocity, which also depends on the traps. So we figured that deep traps can well explain that. And we used these parameters as input to not only model the light and dark JV, but also recombination losses, the recombination currents at VOC. That is basically the quasi-Fermi level splitting of half stacks. So we simulated also the quasi-Fermi level splitting of the half stacks with these lifetimes. Also the VOC versus intensity, the ideality factor, and several devices with different transport layers. So this worked all quite well. And on top of that, for degradation, we tracked also PLQY as a function of time of different half stacks, and we did not find significant changes in the PLQY. This is an interesting experiment, and it should be done regularly during degradation. And this needs to be repeated more in the future. But what we see is actually a small VOC loss, which is not the most decisive for this degradation in this cell, but the quasi-Fermi level splitting in PLQY was rather unchanged. So we figured that the deep traps might not be the main culprit of degradation losses, otherwise it would reduce the PLQY. Okay, so far so good, but in recent works from various other groups, including the group of Thomas Kirchertz, they found that perhaps the deep traps are not the main issue for determining actually the recombination losses in the cells. How did they observe this? Well, when they do transient PL, and in particular doing it for different repetition rates like 20 kilohertz. They see that the transient PL decay continues to flatten out. So it doesn't follow an exponential, very characteristic decay that is expected for deep traps. Instead, they get some sort of a power law behavior, but it's not bimolecular recombination, not band-to-band recombination, but it's shallow traps. And these shallow traps are occupied depending on the illumination intensity. And this leads to the lifetime being a function of the quasi-Fermi level splitting or illumination intensity. There's no clear lifetime at all. So that's very surprising and very important. And they also found extremely high lifetimes at very low quasi-Fermi level splittings that exceed 100 microseconds at this quasi-Fermi level splitting. In addition, our colleagues at the ESFH in Hameln found that shallow traps can actually induce hysteresis effects, very reminiscent to the mobile ions. So we need to look into this in more detail. And to set up our model, we consider a simple process that happens during degradation in perovskite solar cells, which is the oxidation of the iodine by the presence of a free hole. This hole can kick out the iodine, and the iodine become an interstitial, and the halide vacancy also remains. And these two vacancies, the interstitial here and the vacancy here, they are halide defects, and they can be traps, as you know, or mobile ions. And now let's consider one case. Let's consider that this vacancy is a mobile ion. So the vacancy can move and another iodine jumps in there. And the interstitial could be a trap. And which kind of trap? It would be actually, from DFT simulations, it would be actually an acceptor trap that is above the valence band, like here. So now we consider what happens actually with such acceptor traps. And here we see the carrier density in the device for such acceptor traps, and they will accept electrons, so they trap electrons, and we get significant electron trapping here, 5 times 10 to the power 15. And at the same time, we get p doping in the cell. The carrier density here in the bulk might be 3 times to the power 60 per cubic centimeter. So that's considered to be p-doped in our understanding, and it's actually not really consistent with earlier works from our group, but also many others who found that the perovskite is very intrinsic. Meanwhile, we also have free electrons here. So these are these acceptor traps above the valence band. And importantly, we call them shallow doping traps, because we want to distinguish them from actually another sort of traps, which is the acceptor just below the conduction band, here in the dashed line. And we call these the real shallow traps, so the shallow traps, because they do not cause so much doping. Actually, the lines here in dashed correspond to the free holes they introduce, which is still somewhat p-doped, but much less than for the doping traps. They also trap electrons and so on. So these dashed lines correspond to these traps. By the way, this is for input densities of 10 to the power 18 per cubic centimeter. And yes, this is a work from my student Zhaoyu, who has done quite a lot of work on this project. Yeah, it's a little bit information dense. So I apologize for that already. Yes. So he considered 6 ion trap models to understand the impact of ions and shallow traps. So first is the reference model. This is what I showed just before, the reference model we established to model this triple cation perovskite. It includes deep traps, interface recombination, and so on. Then we have the ion model, and for ions, we consider one or the other species mobile, or we consider the cations being mobile and the anions being immobile. And all of this, it doesn't really matter for our results. They all give the same hysteresis features. I mean, not exactly the same, but very similar trends. So it doesn't quite matter. So we stick to cations being mobile and anions being immobile. Then we consider the models with shallow traps. And we have here the doping shallow traps and the real shallow traps. So these do not have mobile ions. And then we have the combined models. So for the cations D traps, which is a strange name, but this means we have cations moving and we have doping type traps as well. And then we have another model with cations moving, but also immobilized anions and shallow type traps as well. So cations as traps. So these are two models that are combined, ions and traps. All right. So let's understand now how these traps influence the scan rate dependent efficiency. And this graph is actually the most information dense in my talk. It looks a little bit dodgy. There are some dashed lines left. That is because I have some transitions and so on. Yeah, this graph tells us a lot. So this is for the doping type traps where the acceptor is above the valence band. And we see here how this changes with energy level. And the first energy level is 0.1 eV above the valence band. And you notice here that this causes incredible losses. And the input density is 10 to the power 17 per cubic centimeter. So that's not too much. So you probably have heard that shallow traps do not influence much the performance of perovskite solar cells, right? But meanwhile, we are getting here only 7% efficiency or 6% in steady state. So such doping type traps, they can significantly compromise the device performance. And that's not because of SRH recombination, but because they introduce doping, which causes field screening. So that's quite an important finding. And we see also that the peak hysteresis changes with the trap depth. So the further it is away from the valence band, the slower the peak hysteresis becomes. And that is because it becomes slower to detrap the charges. The maximum hysteresis effects we get at 0.2 EV from the band edge. This is the maximum hysteresis we can model. I think our colleagues at ESFH, they also found this already, that this trap depth is the most critical. Okay, so how do we know the capture rate, or how do we know how fast they are? So we have our experimental results where we see the peak hysteresis at approximately 10 volts per second from the FH measurement, fast hysteresis. 10 volts per second. This is where the maximum hysteresis typically occurs. So which capture rate should we choose? So it depends on the energy depth, right, as we see here. So let's say for an energy depth of 0.2, we need to use a capture rate of 10 to the power minus 14 cubic centimeter per second to reproduce the experimental peak hysteresis. And where are the experimental values? Well, we have this one study from the CUHK group, which found from trans-NPL that the capture rates are in this regime. And that is approximately 4 orders of magnitude faster than what we see in the fast hysteresis. So that is quite important. So if such shallow traps exist and cause hysteresis, they need to be much slower than observed in trans-NPL. So basically, they would not contribute to recombination. These would be traps, but not recombination centers. So they can trap and then detrap again, but doesn't cause recombination. And this could be there. How do we really know? Furthermore, in CUHK's work, they fitted the trans-NPL with the shallow type traps. So not with doping type traps, which is our simulations for doping type traps. So this is also not consistent. Why is this not consistent? Because this is what the shallow traps do in blue here. So the acceptor is now close to the conduction band, and it causes actually an inverse hysteresis. Sorry, I maybe should have explained before. Solid lines mean the reverse scan, which is typically always better, and the dashed line is the forward scan direction. And for the shallow traps, it changes, so we get inverse hysteresis. And for the position of peak hysteresis, we get exactly the same trend as for the doping type traps. So such shallow type traps cause actually inverse hysteresis. So there are other considerations. One is, what about the compensation? Like in the DFT simulations, if we have these Halo defects, we always have acceptors and donors. So far, we only considered one acceptor. But what if we also add the donor, like this here? Then we get actually a compensation of the traps. This is the same as compensated doping, basically. The hysteresis completely vanishes in this case. So in order to cause such massive hysteresis, the traps need to be ultra slow. They need to cause doping. And they need to be uncompensated. That can actually happen if we have unstoichiometric unstoichiometric compositions, or so, where we have an excess of iodine, for example. So we would not exclude that these traps are uncompensated. And with that, they also compensate the hysteresis effects. And we get the same effect for the shallow trap traps. So when we add the donors here for the shallow traps, shallow acceptors here and donors here, they also the inverse hysteresis also disappears. So it works also the other way around. Okay, so having understand what the trap models do in principle, we want to understand what actually happens and which type of losses are they causing. So we look at the scan rate dependent efficiency. And we see here 4 different models again. The reference model, which does not cause hysteresis. In blue is the ions model, always for input densities of 10 to the power 17. Ions model is typical result. And here is the doping type traps model. And this orange line is the combined model. And we want to understand how other groups, which kind of losses are they introducing. So we look at the JSC, and we see also for the doping type traps this step function behavior in the current. So that is very reminiscent to mobile ions, and it indicates field screening effects. And indeed, when we look at the band diagrams compared to the reference, and these are band diagrams at 0 volt under illumination, and the reference does not have field screening, so this is 0.1. And then we look at the band diagrams at other points, and all of them shows field screening. Therefore, the efficiency is lower. And for example, 0.5 here for the shallow doping traps has a less field screening than at 0.4. So 0.5 has a higher efficiency than 0.4 because it has less field screening there. So the bottom line here is that shallow traps also cause losses by causing field screening. Basically, the trap charges slowly detrap, and then they screen the field as well. They are so similar to mobile ions, basically, if they are there. Finally, we look at also the shallow traps, not the shallow doping traps, but the shallow traps here in pink at 0.6, and we do not get so much field screening there. And this is also the combined model with the shallow traps. So we find here that all of these models cause losses due to field screening. And the slow detrapping and trapping of charges is responsible for that in case of the trap models. Okay, so let's try to understand the aging results. That's what we actually wanted to do. Here we do fast hysteresis measurement experimentally in the fresh cell and the aged cell. And we degrade it to 50% of the initial efficiency roughly. And we see these ionic losses increasing and some fast losses. Why do we call it fast losses? Sounds a little bit strange. That is because we don't quite understand this loss yet. We cannot, well, we sort of think we understand it, but we cannot decouple it further. So we just assign it to a, not yet fully specified loss. And for mobile ions, we get this result. So what are we doing here? We actually increase the input density from 5 times 10 to the power 16 to 1 times 10 to the power 18. per cubic centimeter. So we just increase the input density to values we observe in base measurements, for example, roughly. And we want to see how this affects the results. So for ions, we get this behavior where the ionic losses increase most of all. But the losses at fast scan speeds depend heavily on the pre-bias conditions, so we need to take this into account as well. So what happens for the shallow type traps? Here we have the doping type traps, and basically there's a parallel downward shift, so it indicates non-ionic losses. For the shallow traps, you also have a parallel downward shift, and the inverse hysteresis increases with more input density. And these are the combined models. So we take the ions, and then, for example, for this graph, we take ions and shallow doping traps. So that's cations, E traps. So they belong together. Here, bottom line, we just added the ions. And these two also belong together. Yeah, so for cation D traps model, we see that it's more similar to the ions model, and the cation shallow traps model is actually more a combination of ions and shallow traps. In particular, we get losses at fast scan speeds and more ionic losses. So we simply plot these ionic losses upon aging in blue and the fast losses in red for the different models. And this turquoise is the initial ionic loss, and compare it with the experiment. So roughly we can see that this model, cations and shallow traps, is reproducing the experiment best. But depending on the exact simulation settings, we cannot rule out the others, except these shallow traps is not consistent. But the others could perhaps somehow potentially reproduce the experiment. So we are not ruling them out from this experiment. So what about the charge extraction? With aging, we see typically a massive increase of the extracted charge, doing a base measurement where we simply switch in the dark from VOC to 0 volt. And then we collect the current and integrate the current to get the extracted carrier density. And we see that it significantly increases. So what happens with mobile ions? When we increase the density from 5 times 10 to the power 16, 2 million numbers, to 1 times 10 to the power 18, we see that the extracted carrier density is very much stuck in a way. By no way we are seeing 10 to the power 18, which would be up there. So it is stuck to some value of 10 to the power 16. And this we already explained earlier in the work of Jonas. That is because if we have so many ions there, and then basically when we try to extract them at 0 volt, they will screen the field, and in the field-free regions, the ions won't move, so they will not contribute to the current. So we will always be limited to the electrode charge, in theory, but in the experiment we are not, and we are trying to understand this. In the experiment, we often get 10 to the power 18, even 10 to the power 19, if we measure a little bit longer. So we're trying to understand this. So one idea was early on, what if that's actually shallow trap? Because the shallow traps is free charges. When we switch to 0 volt, free charges, they are trapped, but eventually they come out. So we could extract all the trapped charges eventually. So can we reproduce large input densities with shallow traps? And the question is no. Again, the answer is no. Again, we are very much stuck to these densities of 10 to the power 16. Here shallow doping traps and here shallow traps. And here is the combined models. When we add ions to the shallow traps, again, we do not see a significant increase of the extracted carrier density at long times. For this model, cations S traps, we get actually a combination of ions, and then we see an additional bump due to the shallow traps. So also the models with shallow traps cannot reproduce the experiment, and that is because getting out is in carrier density between VOC and 0 volt. And even at 0 volt, we will have large charge accumulation in the device because we have such large input densities. So the carrier density between VOC and 0 volt doesn't change so much. Furthermore, not all the traps are occupied, but that's another reason. So we cannot extract all the charges. And one group we can still rule out, which is the shallow doping traps, because we see here that when we increase the input carrier density to 10 to the power 18, we're getting additional charges out at early times. And these are the free doping-induced charges. So here we are extracting some doped charges, and this is not observed in the experiment. So next we simulated capacitance versus frequency, trying to reproduce the experiment, where we also see a very large capacitance at low frequencies. Again, this is done at 0 volt pre-bias and in the dark. And we simulate this first with mobile ions. And here we need to note that the X scale is very different to the experiment, where we are limited. So this green range is the experimental time scale. And these are free lines for different input ion densities. And again, we are stuck to relatively low capacitances of 10 to the power minus 7, while in the experiments it's 10 to the power minus 6. So we are limited in a similar way than in base. We cannot fully reproduce the large features, although there could be ways to reproduce it, but not in this simulation. So what happens with the shallow type traps? For the real shallow type traps, we do not see any significant increase of the capacitance at all at 0 volt, probably because there are no or very little doping-induced charges. And here we have the shallow doping type traps, and there we see kind of the opposite, where the capacitance rises at very high frequencies, 10 to the power 9 hertz already, which is extremely fast, the capacitance rises. So this is not observed in the experiment at all. So we can actually rule that out. And again, these are the free charges, the doping-induced charges, which are very fast. And then when we look at the combined models for the cations D-traps model, it's dominated by the doping type traps, and the cations S-trap model is dominated by the ions. It also makes sense looking at these graphs. Okay, and anything with doping-induced traps is not consistent, and shallow type traps is also not consistent. So in another experiment, we look at temperature-dependent fast hysteresis. And first we measured, let me check the time. Talking already quite long, but not much longer. We are trying to measure the temperature-dependent hysteresis, and we see a 10 Kelvin and going to 75. We do see some degradation in this device. When we go back to 10 Kelvin, it's a little bit degraded, but the peak hysteresis stays at the same point. So now we simulated this for the ion, all the models with ions. And we see here how the peak hysteresis changes with temperature. And when we take the peak hysteresis and plot it as a function of temperature, all of these models behave the same and can reproduce the experiment rather well. So the ion models fit. In contrast, shallow models with traps only do not fit. And we also observe here some characteristic features. Here we observe another sort of hysteresis, and here as well, an inverse hysteresis. And that is actually slightly observed in the experiment. So overall, it looks like the whole hysteresis features is more controlled by ions, but then when the device degrades a little bit, we get the inverse hysteresis feature as well, which is a small add-on. And you might be wondering, okay, this could be an experimental error, or it doesn't look very convincing. Yeah, indeed, it doesn't look so significant here. But if you look at the PCE parameters, it looks very similar to this case that we actually simulate. We have the data in the SI. Okay, so overall controlled by ions, but shallow traps appear as well. And we also simulate photoluminescence quantum yield for fresh and aged samples. First, this is just the device VUC, and we can simulate the loss we see upon aging, so that these dashed lines are aged devices again, and we look at different models, and the cation S-trap model can reproduce this. And it also predicts actually an increase of quasi-Fermi level splitting in the cell, as observed in the experiment. But for other stacks, the ions model explains the experiment a little bit better. But overall, we don't trust this experiment too much because we are also slightly limited by halide segregation in this 1.63 EV cell, which also can increase the PLQI. So this we do not take as very conclusive, but it could be used in principle if we can exclude halide segregation completely. Okay, so this brings me to the conclusions. Here I summarize all the features and observations we found for different experiments. So here, fast hysteresis base, CF, and so on. We find that models with only traps are not so consistent with the experiment, but all the models with ions are a little bit better, and in particular ions only and ions with shallow traps seem to fit best our aging data. So what does this all mean? This is a typical experiment where we measure the fast hysteresis during the aging. And we see that these fast to slow losses are dominant here. And our study further supports that this fast to slow losses is very much dominated by ions. And the ion density plays a role, and also other parameters that influence the ionic losses. Shallow doping type traps can contribute to these fast to slow losses under three conditions that need to be fulfilled simultaneously. These traps need to be ultra slow, they need to be uncompensated, and doping needs to be observed at the same time during the aging, which is not the case in our sample. If this is fulfilled, doping traps can also contribute there. The mechanism how this loss is introduced is by field screening. In addition, we find here the fast losses, and we already knew this can be non-ionic losses, and they can be influenced by ion accumulation at the interface. And in this work, we also find that shallow traps contribute to these fast losses. And depending on the sample, of course, the contribution of the fast losses can be more or less. So in one sentence, we can conclude that ions and shallow traps coexist during the degradation, but the effect of the ions appears to be stronger than the shallow traps. And we believe this is due to the compensation effect of the traps. So with this, I want to thank my group members for their hard work and many collaborators over the years and various organizations for funding. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Martin, for this nice talk. Truly nice combined experimental and simulation work, as I always see from your side. I'm sure people have quite some questions. Please write them in the chat also during my contribution, and then in the end we will do a Q&A session together. So I will now present, you could say, complementary work, which is part of a project currently running here with the focus on also ion-related parameters. Hysteresis measurement fitting is also part. So what I will show today is, as I mentioned, complementary in the sense of if I look at your work, I mean, you mentioned sometimes you go to the power of 19, but often I see ion densities reported in your work up to maybe 1 to the 17 or 118 per cubic centimeter. So in this project, I had the chance to get hands on cells with a seemingly bulk ion density quite higher up. It seems to be to the power of 19 in pristine devices, and I will show in a second why we are assuming such a high ion density. If I look at this work from Schmidt, which looked into the limitations of ion parameter extraction, you could visibly by eye, if you look at these different methods in this one figure here of the manuscript of the work of them, you see all these measurements combined, you charge extraction base. You see here also a low frequency mod Schottky, capacitance-based measurement to extract ion density, and then just simply an impedance spectroscopy frequency scan, which is also highly, the low frequency part dependent on ion density, as you can see here. So visibly by eye, and that was the message also of the manuscript, you could say from power of 18, it seems to be limited. And that's what we could look into, because as I mentioned, we are assuming in these devices we are working with an bulk ion density of power 19 per cubic centimeter. And we assume this because we did, or particularly Davide did, an extensive modeling study combining JV measurement, transient, and also impedance spectroscopy at different settings, where specifically the impedance spectroscopy in the dark, 0 volt at low frequency, as I mentioned, is very sensitive to the ion bulk density. So specifically by alter the transport layer of the device by changing the thickness, the model fits quite well to the experiment and can reproduce this low frequency features. So this justifies the choice of using a high ion density in this system, and also at the same time the transport layer model. The full study is even published. You can look at it on the webpage as a blog post. So with these large bulk ion densities, where as I showed before, also literature assumes we are in a limited range, as Martin also mentioned. I had the chance to take these devices and do these different measurements, so the charge extraction on the left side, but also then the low frequency mod Schottky. And the result is, as the work suggested, that the measured ion densities, or the extracted one from the measurement, show a rather low bulk ion density, which agrees with the simulation, with the model of the same measurements quite well. Specifically, the low frequency mod Schottky aligns, but you have to note that for the model, the bulk ion density was chosen to be power of 19 per cubic centimeter. So as Martin also mentioned, the work of Jonas Diekmann in the former group in Potsdam, he showed this already, specifically for base, that you have a limitation. So you can see here power of 19, which we assume is in the device, is not even shown on the plot. And as Martin mentioned already, I looked myself into this already, specifically at this high ion density, you are limited because the charge extraction measurement you are having is a result, or the transient itself is a result of the bulk field that gets screened with time. So the integrated density you get at these high ion densities is rather a measure for the ion density you need to screen the bulk electric field. So this is known and has been already discussed in several works. So if you would place these different measurements here on a graph with a threshold of bulk electric field screening, you would place low frequency mod Schottky above and base somewhat below. But as Martin also mentioned already, it seems to be that base also moves beyond this threshold, and the question still is why. On top of that, there is like time of flight response time measurements, which where you can extract ion mobility, and these work also well below the threshold of bulk electric field screening. So the point I want to make in this contribution is, if we go back to this plot where we see a big change in capacitance with transport layer variation, this also means then that C60 layer in this case is strongly influencing this low frequency capacitance. And if we model this low frequency mod Schottky extraction for different input bulk ion densities, in the case of a C60 layer, which is undoped, we see that with such a transport layer undoped, you basically are limited quite strongly in the extraction of in the measurement of the ion density, and only if you, in the model you dope your transport layer strongly, such that it is not limiting anymore, the low frequency Matthias analysis works over quite a range of ion density. And as you can see, the measured ion density with low frequency Matthias aligns with the model well. So how does this look like for base? There on the other side, it looks like transport layer properties do not have a big influence, specifically in the range below power of 18, where the extracted density from the base measurement is still relatively well, surely relatively aligned to the model input ion density. So if I expand this graph to transport layer capacitance limitation, you can see here that there is now this gap top right where our investigated devices sit, where the bulk electric field is surely screened, but also the system is limited by the transport layer capacitance. And that's just in a quick note, one point, the conclusion I want to make, which I feel like needs some more attention in the field as well. There is work which looked into this, but in these methods, consideration of transport layer properties, capacitance is quite relevant as well. And I know that people are working on it. There is still a chance for models that can describe this area here, but that's ongoing work we're also looking into. So before going to Q&A, I just want to mention briefly an advertisement for a conference we have here, which is strongly focused on simulation as well, but we also have quite an experimental talks. And we have an extended abstract submission deadline until June 19th. So if you're interested in physics also of such devices, we are having quite some Perovskite talks as well, but also other topics like OLED and batteries. Please register if you're interested. So with that, let us go to the Q&A session, and I will start with a personal question, Martin, because I know how time-consuming it is to do modeling studies, and especially in the figure I showed where you have such a nice agreement of hysteresis measurement with different ion densities, that takes time. So I was wondering, in your lab, are there some people only focusing on simulation? And how is it? How do you do this, like in your group?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, indeed, it's very time consuming. So you can ask Cao Yu, I guess he might be here as well. Yeah, it is very time consuming, but I guess you also learn really a lot. And yeah, he does primarily simulations, but not entirely, I would say. So, and I also, every new student gets actually a small task first to do a small simulation project to get some ideas how devices work. And everyone is everyone is encouraged to simulate more, for sure.
And I was also wondering, like the hysteresis measurement and also the charge extraction, which pops up in many of your manuscripts. Do you push this also as a standard characterization in your lab?
Yes, absolutely. Especially starting a new group, we don't have so incredible many measurements, and this we have, so that's definitely a very standard measurement. It's quite useful for sure. So definitely we are doing this along normal JV characterization for sure.
Yeah, that's very nice, and I think also pretty rare. So let me look into the chat. We have a question from Frank Niersch. Is there a semiconductor thickness dependence on the findings reported?
So these findings I presented today, not. I guess we have not looked into different thicknesses. I don't think our main trend would change in any respect. If you talk about more general findings, like how the losses in fast hysteresis would behave with thickness, I cannot recall that we have ever plotted it. But since this is a transport loss, it would definitely depend on the thickness for fast hysteresis. To give you one example, so the thickness plays a role for some measurements for sure.
So maybe related to this also, well, since I am currently focusing on transport layer, is like how big is this a topic in your lab currently? Also relating to discussions on secondary electrochemistry effects and ions moving into transport layers. Is this a topic?
Yes, that's definitely a topic. For example, my other student, Chifan, he has looked into the self-assembled monolayers and how it changes the losses due to ions, the ionic losses, and how this relates to reverse bias stability. So that's definitely a key topic. Yeah, he tried to make a very compact and rather thick self-assembled multilayer that is very compact. But making transport layers really, really thick is not a main priority. But in general, this is very important for us, yes. But the findings you presented is certainly very important for us. So I think you solved the issue of being able to simulate the high capacitance, right, with the doped transport layers. So perhaps it indicates that we get somehow doped transport layers.
Well, it just might be that, but it really differs from system to system. But yes, transport layer probably makes sense to look into transport layer characteristics.
Yes.
But as I mentioned also for base, it looks to me that it looks like in the model it's not a big issue for charge extraction.
Yes, so base is still a little bit unexplained, but that's also interesting. So we still try to figure it out what's going actually on.
Yeah. Okay, then we have a question from Rananta. Thanks for your presentation. I have two questions. The cations S-traps is the model that best reproduces the experiment. You are using the same density for both cations and S-traps in the simulations, right?
Yes.
And then if he understands well, the power conversion efficiency loss due to S-traps cations effects is due to field screening. What is the exact mechanism? Is it not a charge collection effect and hence a recombination loss?
It's a recombination loss. Everything is a recombination loss. So we have plotted this. I mean, Cao has plotted this. So the mechanism with the shallow traps is field screening, and he switched off several losses, like interface losses, switched off, and so on. And the field screening is only an issue if you have other strong recombination present. Well, even bimolecular recombination, radiative recombination can become an issue if you have field screening, which cannot be switched off. But basically, the field screening becomes so bad if you have significant interface recombination. So this is in the supporting information. We can also send you this graph where we looked into this.
Okay, then we have a question which might be to both of us in some way. So if base is not limited to contact charges in experiment, or how is it? Why is base not limited to contact charges? That was probably my statement. So I'm coming there from the fact that that low frequency mod Schottky is very much limited, because what you're doing then with the measurement by changing the voltage and looking at capacitance, you are actually changing the capacitance of the transport layer. So you're seeing modulations in the transport layer, and for base, well, it's a charge extraction. It's not the same situation. You're not modulating the transport layer properties directly. And the other point there is that you are limited then in the high ion density regime anyway. So maybe in the lower density regime, transport layers are not that relevant, but that's still a point also to look further into. So Martin, there is another question. So base has been frequently used for ion density, and Mailgar is asking about Salif-related techniques, such as metal insulator, Salif, I don't know what it stands for anymore. Is this also suitable? Did you look into Salif for Perovskite?
Yes, thank you. We did investigate Salif in the work from Jonas, and it is very similar to base. It is just a little bit worse because we have this. So the large extraction comes from charges really moving far distances, basically. And at least in classical Salif, if you start at 0 volt and then go to reverse a little bit, then you also already have the ions at the contacts at 0 volt where you start. So they don't move so much distance, basically. And it becomes, you don't extract so much charges as you input, even less so than in normal base. So it behaves similar, and it's a little bit worse than base. Although you could say, okay, then what if I do a VOC pre-bias in Salif? I think that can be done. And Miss Salif, yes, that was a long time ago. I remember from Adalan some works. Yeah, that prevents the injection somehow, I guess. Yeah, I cannot recall, but yes, I don't. We have not looked into this specifically. I cannot say it's better or not. Yes, thank you. Maybe I can also briefly mention again on the base. So because there was the other question, why is it not limited to the electrode charge? And the only explanation that I have at the moment, well, there's two maybe. One would be a simple one, that somehow charges come from outside of the active area, but we have looked into this. I don't partially looked into this, need to repeat again, but I don't think this is the critical issue. And another explanation could be that because we have these electrode reactions, basically, so the ions can be extracted actually by an electrode reaction. So the charge, the ion goes out eventually through a electrode reaction, kind of a counter charge. This might be very speculative, and it would also mean that repeated base would completely deplete the device from the ions, which seems to be a little bit unlikely. But that's the only half reasonable explanation that I have. So yeah, I hope the community can figure this out very soon, and us too as well. Thank you.
So then we have a question from Antonia. Thanks for your nice presentation. So the conclusion is that ions have a large impact on power loss over time. Would your conclusion remain true if the aging would be carried out by alternating light and dark conditions like during the day? Wouldn't there be a recover of the loss? If so, then ions are not causing the degradation, but only apparent loss related to aging method.
Yes, that is a very good question. And yes, indeed, we have looked into this. Due to the recovery effect, it might appear that the ions are then not so critical if you do light and dark cycling, but indeed we see the same ionic losses. And they're also very much locked in after a long time. So it's not published, but we have done these experiments. We still see the ionic losses.
Okay, let me do 3 more short questions. thanks for the talk. What could be responsible when passivated devices show more ionic loss compared to the control?
Right. Yeah, this reminds me of another work from Felix in Potsdam, where they have looked at 2D passivation. And it's a passivation for VOC, but it introduces more ions and higher ion density initially. So with poor 2D capping layers, it appears to be that we get more ions initially and larger ionic losses. And that causes 1-2 milliamps more in current loss, even in fresh devices, which then becomes even worse with aging. So this can happen if you make one thing better, but another thing worse.
And then in slide 10, double hysteresis can be seen at various scan rates for different energetic offsets. Why is the question?
Slide 10?
Slide 10.
Okay, let me check what was on slide 10. Right. Yeah, should I share this again? Yeah, this is hard to understand for everyone if not visible. So we get basically another hysteresis feature at the fast scan speeds at 1000. And yeah, indeed. So this is a combination of displacement current effects, but also we have the deep traps present from the reference group. And deep traps cause some small hysteresis effects. And we can move this to any time scale because we don't quite know the capture coefficient. So these deep traps also influence at fast time scales, and it's also coupled with the displacement current effects at that point. And yes, it also changed with energy, with the trap energy level. Yes, that's interesting why.
All right, let me wrap.
Sorry.
Yeah. Let me wrap up with one question, maybe into the future, something we are also looking into, which is related to the charge extraction as well. So there are secondary or effects, electrochemistry effects, you could call degradation, which leads to secondary ionic effects, maybe moving into transport layers. That's one thing I have in mind with respect to base. Could these then features on slower time scales also be part of the integrated base signal, and explain why you can go to power 19? Did you look into this specific?
Yes, we did not fully look into this. Indeed, I believe that there is something in the transport layers, or a lot in the transport layers, which takes a long time to get out. Yeah, if we do the measurements with the Keithley, we get in the H device, it continues to rise, the extracted charge to above 10 to the power 18. It could be very well some ions in the transport layers that are slowly released. Yeah, we think that could happen.
All right. Martin, thank you very much for your contribution. Truly a delight to see your combined experimental and modeling work and focus on ionic characterization. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you everyone for attending. We will be having a break over July and August, but we'll return on September 17th with our next guest, Professor Joanna Milic from University of Turku in Finland. In the meantime, again, I'd like to draw your attention to the CMWeb conference, which will take place here in Winterthur. It would be great to see some of you there. Thanks again, everyone, and Martin specifically, and enjoy your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.